They say the wilderness is unforgiving, but Ethan Carver didn't get lost. He didn't fall. He disappeared, and the forest somehow made sure no one ever saw him again. Glacier National Park looks peaceful in photographs. Towering pines, sparkling lakes, jagged ridges bathed in sunlight, snow-capped peaks glinting in the distance. It is the kind of place people imagine when they think of untamed beauty, the ultimate escape from city noise. But the photographs lie. Up close, Glacier is different. Trails twist through cliffs that lean in, creating shadows that stretch longer than they should. The silence has weight. It presses against your ears, creeps into your chest, fills the spaces between your thoughts. You can feel it settling, waiting. Sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you might hear a low, pulsing thrum beneath the rocks, vibrating in a rhythm that makes your teeth ache, a rhythm that doesn't belong. Locals know the truth. Certain trails swallow people. Footprints vanish, as if the forest itself swallows them whole. Guides whisper warnings to hikers who dare stray from marked paths. If the forest wants you, they say, it can track you, mislead you, and erase every trace. No search party, no helicopter, no dog will find you. Even seasoned rangers avoid some areas. The backcountry keeps its secrets, and it does not let go. Ethan Carver, 42, was one of the most respected rangers in Glacier. Over 15 years, he had learned to read the mountains, predict sudden weather shifts, track wildlife, and even sense the forest's subtler movements. He knew when a ridge might collapse, when a hidden creek would rise overnight, and when a trail was alive in a way most people couldn't understand. On August 17th, he signed out at the St. Mary station at 7:45 in the morning. His pack was methodically arranged: dehydrated meals, water bottles, a weather radio, a GPS device with extra batteries, a first aid kit, climbing rope, and his personal field journal. The assignment was routine: a 3-day patrol along the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail, a remote backcountry stretch rarely traversed by hikers. The trail offered breathtaking views of alpine lakes and cliffs, but it was unforgiving. Narrow ridges, steep drop-offs, and sudden fogs made it treacherous, but never impossible. Until that day, the first hours were mundane. Carver recorded observations in his journal: a herd of deer grazing near Hidden Lake, a pair of marmots darting across sunlit rocks, a lone bald eagle gliding above the valley. The weather remained clear, skies a crisp blue. Around 3 in the afternoon, he checked in with the ranger station by radio. His voice was calm, precise, almost casual. But the first anomaly appeared in a single line that evening. Low-frequency hum near North Ridge. Not wind, not machinery. Uncertain source. Carver may have assumed it was a distant generator from park operations, or some natural vibration echoing through the cliffs. He made a note, then moved on, continuing his patrol. By late evening, the forest revealed its true face. He set up his tent in a small clearing near a grove of pines. The wind had died completely. Even the insects were silent. Birds that usually called after dusk were gone, and then the hum returned. Louder, deeper, pulsing through the ground, into his bones, vibrating through teeth and skull. It was rhythmic, almost alive. Carver paused, listening. Shadows moved just at the edge of his vision, bending unnaturally. His journal entries grew frantic, but still precise. He wrote about feeling eyes on him, about the trees leaning closer, about shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. His breath fogged in the warm night air. The hum pulsed like a heartbeat, resonating from the rocks, the pines, even the soil beneath him. He described shapes bending the air, too tall, too thin to define, moving unnaturally among the trees. He tried to rationalize. It could be seismic, could be machinery, could be anything, he wrote. But even he admitted, no, this is different. The forest itself watches. It waits, and it is patient. And then, near midnight, he noticed something that made him pause entirely. The trail behind him looked wrong. Not blocked, not broken, just subtly altered, as if the forest had shifted while he wasn't looking. Footprints that should have been there were gone, and in their place, an impression he couldn't explain, a shallow groove in the soil that seemed to lead somewhere deeper, away from the path he knew so well. Carver wrote in his journal with growing tension, the pen shaking in his hands. I cannot tell if I am still on the trail. I hear whispers, not words, not human, not animal. They echo off the rocks, following me. I cannot see them, but I feel them move. They are waiting. I do not know what comes next. I need to keep moving. The night pressed down heavier than any darkness Ethan had ever known. His flashlight cut through the trees, but the beam bent oddly at the edges, as if the shadows themselves were alive, curling around the trunks and rocks. Every crackle of the forest floor sounded like footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. The low hum had grown louder. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, or perhaps his heartbeat had synchronized with it. He couldn't tell. Each vibration made the soil feel as if it were breathing beneath his boots. Carver's journal captured every observation, every detail. He wrote of the whispering sound, too soft to form words, yet deliberate, repetitive, like it was learning his name, memorizing it, mocking it. Around 2 a.m, the first real panic set in. He tried to follow his map, double-checking coordinates on his GPS, but the device had gone berserk. Numbers jumped erratically, switching between locations miles apart in seconds. The compass spun in an endless circle. He scribbled, I am walking in a circle. The trail moves under my feet. This is no accident. It watches. It knows. Then came the shadows. They weren't animals. Not deer, not wolves, nothing natural. They moved fluidly, bending the space between trees, stretching tall and impossibly thin. One moment they were behind him, the next beside him, the next reflected in the light of his flashlight in a place they shouldn't exist. Carver wrote of trying to back away slowly, but the shadows mirrored him inch for inch, step for step, making it impossible to determine which way led forward and which way was trap. The clearing where he had pitched his tent was gone, or maybe it had never been there. Rocks shifted subtly, pine needles gathered unnaturally in small piles. The windless air warped around him. And always, the hum, the low, vibrating hum that seemed to penetrate everything. His bones, his mind, even the ink on his journal pages. He tried shouting, "Hello, anyone there?" His voice sounded hollow, echoing off granite cliffs that shouldn't have reflected sound like that. His own words returned almost immediately, but twisted, slowed, distorted. In the echoes, he thought he heard something else. Laughter, soft, almost like children, but wrong. Wrongly pitched, impossible. By 3, Ethan began abandoning reason entirely. He packed his tent quickly, not neatly, his hands trembling, the journal half filled with desperate notes. He left behind some of his gear, though it was not out of forgetfulness. He was in a rush, but not to leave the park. He was being pulled. He felt it in his chest, in the soles of his boots, in the vibration of the soil itself. The forest wanted him moving, wanted him off the path, and somewhere deep in his gut, he knew that every step he took was being observed, catalogued, and judged. Then the impossible happened. A single boot print appeared in the soil near the pine grove where he had packed his belongings. It was his own, facing away from the trail, toward the thick, uncharted forest beyond the ridge. He froze. The ground was firm, undisturbed, yet there it was, the mark of a step he hadn't taken. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness, every nerve screaming, and saw a thin shadow retreating between the trees. Ethan tried to rationalize it, even as his journal trembled in his hands. There is no one there. There is no one there. But the trace is real. It's following me. It knows. The trail isn't real. The trees are alive. He began walking, not along the path he had mapped, not along the trail he knew, but following some internal, inexplicable pull. Every step forward made the hum sharper, closer, almost suffocating. His flashlight flickered, sometimes illuminating what looked like twisted faces etched in bark, or maybe the impression of something watching him from inside the tree trunks. He whispered to himself, trying to stay sane. Just keep moving. Keep moving. Don't look back. Don't stop. Hours passed. Minutes felt like days. The forest shifted. Rocks, trees, shadows, they all moved in subtle ways that he could feel but not see. And then, somewhere in the distance, a voice called his name. It was faint, barely audible, almost drowned in the hum, but unmistakable. Not from a person, not from any human source he could identify. Just a voice drawing him deeper into the darkness, further away from the trailhead he knew, further from any chance of rescue. Carver wrote his final coherent note. I think it's here. I can feel it in every step. It wants me to leave the path. I must follow, or I will be left behind. I am not afraid, but I am alone, alone, alone. The trees closed in, though he knew he hadn't strayed that far. Every ridge he rounded looked the same. Every clearing mirrored the last. The forest seemed endless, stretching and folding in ways his eyes and mind could not comprehend. The hum had become unbearable, a throbbing pulse he could feel in his chest and in the soles of his boots. It was no longer distant, it was inside him, sensing with his own heartbeat, and with it came the whispers. Low, overlapping, neither male nor female, repeating his name in patterns that made no sense, yet felt purposeful. Ethan tried to mark his path, leaving small scratches on tree bark, dropping pebbles, tying strips of cloth. Within minutes, every marker was gone. The scratches had smoothed into the bark, as if they'd never existed. The cloth had vanished. Pebbles that had rolled into a straight line now littered the forest in random clusters. The trail behind him no longer made sense. It looped, twisted, disappeared. By early morning, exhaustion had set in. His stomach growled, but hunger felt distant compared to the pressure pressing down on him. Shapes began to appear in the periphery of his vision, tall, thin figures bending light around them, shadows moving against the natural flow of wind. They did not run, did not chase. They waited, and every time Ethan tried to focus, the shapes would flicker, vanish, or reappear in impossible positions. He spoke aloud, trying to reason with himself. It's the terrain. Fog, shadows, fatigue. It's nothing else. But even as he said it, the ground shifted subtly beneath his feet, softening then hardening, forming shallow grooves where none had existed, guiding him deeper into the dense forest. Hours later, or maybe it was days, he stumbled upon a small cabin, half collapsed and hidden behind thick pines. It looked abandoned, left to rot decades ago. Yet the air inside carried a metallic, almost coppery smell, and the floorboards groaned under a weight that was not his own. On a table lay a journal, old, yellowed, with pages describing disappearances over a century, the words written in frantic, looping script. The forest watches, the forest chooses. Do not leave the path. Those who do are not returned. Ethan copied a few lines into his own journal. As he did, the hum intensified, vibrating through every part of him. He realized the cabin itself seemed to pulse, as if breathing in sync with the low-frequency rhythm that had followed him all night. Shadows gathered in the corners, stretching tall and impossibly thin, moving toward him in silence. He tried to run, but the forest resisted. Every step forward became harder, the soil clinging to his boots, the trees leaning inward, closing the space, guiding him off any path he thought he knew. At some point, He looked back, expecting to see the path behind him, the familiar clearing, his tent, but it was gone. No trace of camp remained. Not a stake, not a fold of fabric, not the imprint of a footprint. Only the hum, the shadows, the impossible pull of the forest deeper into its labyrinth. He wrote a final note before leaving the cabin, the pen shaking violently. It is alive. The forest is alive. It wants me deeper. I am going. The trail does not exist. The trees move. The rocks move. I am being taken. I feel it guiding me. I cannot stop. And then the journal stops mid-sentence. No further entries. No indication of which way he went. The cabin remained as it was, untouched, silent, yet somehow still echoing the low-frequency hum, the same vibration that had followed him from the ridge. When search teams later reached the area, they found the cabin empty, the ground undisturbed. No footprints, no dropped equipment, nothing. Just the forest, endless and quiet once more. By the next morning, search teams had been deployed. Helicopters scoured the ridges, drones hovered over the forests, and dozens of rangers combed every trail Ethan might have taken. But Glacier did not want to be searched. From the air, the forests looked as serene as ever. Granite cliffs gleamed in the sunlight, lakes reflected the sky, and nothing seemed amiss. But on the ground, it was different. GPS units fluctuated wildly, sometimes jumping miles away in seconds, rendering maps useless. Radios emitted bursts of static, sometimes punctuated by whispers that made the hairs on the back of every ranger's neck stand. One operator swore he heard his own name called through the static. Search dogs refused to enter certain sections of the forest. They growled at unseen presences, ears flat, tails tucked. Handlers tried to coax them forward, but the animals bolted back to safer ground, refusing to continue. Rangers described the forest as watching and deciding who could move freely and who could not. Even the weather seemed altered. Fog rolled in where none was forecast. Winds shifted suddenly, and shadows bent in impossible angles across rocks and tree trunks. Thermal imaging showed anomalies. Small patches of intense cold appeared in areas surrounded by warmth, only to vanish when a human approached. Heat signatures flickered, as if someone or something was always just out of reach. Rangers reported seeing thin, tall shapes flitting between trees, always at the edge of vision, never stationary. One veteran ranger muttered under his breath, "It doesn't want to be seen, but it wants us here. It's patient." In one abandoned ranger cabin near the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail, a search team found Ethan's last radio signal. The device had turned on by itself, emitting a low-frequency hum far louder than anything mechanical should produce. Static hissed from the speaker, and amidst it, the faint, overlapping voices of children and adults, though no one was present. One ranger swore the radio whispered Ethan's name, stretched and distorted. Personal items belonging to Ethan were found in bizarre arrangements. A water bottle balanced upright on a rock, a flashlight lying on its side, pointing toward dense undergrowth, and his field journal half open, the pages fluttering, though no wind blew. Each object seemed deliberately placed, though no human had touched them. The trails themselves betrayed reality. Footprints appeared and disappeared on granite surfaces, leading nowhere, looping back impossibly. Rocks shifted subtly when stepped upon. Pine needles formed patterns that could not have been natural. One team even reported seeing a figure in the distance, impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, bending the air around it. It didn't move like a person. When they raised binoculars, the figure vanished, leaving only the faint shimmer of heat in the air. By nightfall, every member of the search teams felt the weight of the forest pressing down. Radios crackled with static, GPS devices spun endlessly, and the low-frequency hum grew, vibrating through boots, chests, and bones. Several rangers reported hearing faint laughter in the dark, soft at first, then closer, almost at their own ears. Attempts to call out went unanswered, though the echoes returned distorted, slowed, repeating names that weren't their own. Every attempt to map Ethan's route failed. The forest seemed to shift, trails bending, ridges folding over themselves. Rangers began to feel trapped, the clearing lines dissolving into dense undergrowth. One officer wrote in his log, "We are walking in circles. The path is alive. The forest is alive. It does not want us here, but it will not let us leave." Despite exhaustive efforts, no trace of Ethan Carver was recovered. Not a boot, not a scrap of clothing, not a dropped tool. Only the forest remained, patient and silent again, as if nothing had happened except for the low hum, vibrating through the cliffs, rocks, and trees, lingering in the minds of those who had come searching. By the third day, even the most experienced rangers felt unease gnawing at their instincts. The low-frequency hum was constant now, vibrating through the soil, the rocks, the trees, and the very air around them. Every search party felt it differently, some in their chests, some in their teeth, others in the hair on the back of their necks, but none could deny its presence. A helicopter flew over Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail at first light. From above, the forest looked calm, almost inviting, with sunlight glinting off granite cliffs and lakes, reflecting the clear sky. Yet on the ground, trails led nowhere, footpaths twisted into impossibility, and shadows stretched long and wrong. Ethan Carver's last known tracks had completely vanished. A small ground team discovered a cluster of boulders near the ridge where Ethan had last been seen. The rocks were unnaturally warm to the touch, and when stepped upon, vibrated faintly. In the spaces between them, faint, fresh impressions of his boot appeared, leading into dense undergrowth, then abruptly ending. No other trace existed. As night fell, the hum intensified into a roar. Rangers reported voices overlapping, drawn out, impossible in cadence calling Ethan's name, then other names from past missing person reports in Glacier. Whispers of hikers and campers who had vanished decades ago. Flashlights flickered. Compasses spun without restraint. A sense of being watched and measured pressed down on every team member. One junior ranger, separated briefly from the group, swore he saw Ethan standing on a small cliff edge. He appeared motionless, facing away, gazing into a fogless void. His shape seemed elongated, unreal, bending light around him. When the ranger blinked, Ethan was gone, but the low hum remained, now joined by a faint chorus of whispers, laughing softly from the rocks below. The final attempt to reach Ethan occurred near midnight. Rangers formed a human chain, moving carefully through the undergrowth, flashlights piercing the darkness. For a brief moment, Ethan's voice was heard, calm, but distant, repeating a single phrase over and over. "The forest wants me. The forest wants me." Then silence. When the search ended days later, no human trace of Ethan remained. The camp, his tent, his pack, even the journal that had been his lifeline in the forest, all gone. Only the low-frequency hum lingered, fading gradually, like a heartbeat disappearing into the earth. Rangers returned to their stations, shaken, refusing to speak of what they had experienced, yet knowing the forest was still watching, still waiting. Locals whisper that Glacier National Park keeps its secrets, that it does not forgive intrusion, and that it swallows those who stray too far. Hikers report strange shadows and impossible movements in the backcountry. Electronics fail inexplicably. Some claim to hear voices calling their names in the quiet of the forest, stretched and distorted. Ethan Carver was never found. No boot, no tent, no trace. He simply vanished, as though Glacier itself had reached into the world and erased him from existence. The low hum, they say, still echoes through the cliffs and ridges, waiting for the next person who dares to step off the trail. And somewhere, deep in the twisting shadows of Glacier, the forest waits patiently, silently, for its next visitor. The wilderness watches, and sometimes it waits. Mara Ellison wasn't lost. She wasn't afraid. Yet she vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. It was September 14th, 2014, and the high ridges of Glacier National Park were already kissed with frost. The golden larches dotted the mountainside like scattered embers, standing out against the dense, almost black pines that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Long shadows slanted across narrow trails, winding streams, and jagged rocks, giving the park an uncanny sense of depth and isolation. Mara, a 32-year-old wildlife photographer from Seattle, had come alone, driven by the chance to capture the fleeting perfection of autumn light reflecting off glacial lakes. She moved carefully, every footstep deliberate, every camera angle pre-visualized in her mind. She was skilled, meticulous, patient, but the wilderness has a way of humbling even the most prepared. Locals spoke of Cathedral Peak with hushed reverence, often adding a cautious warning. It's not just wild up there, old guides would say. It watches, it remembers. Hikers and campers who dared the backcountry alone sometimes never returned. Some claimed the trees seemed to shift in the corner of their eyes, shadows bending impossibly, whispering voices echoing just beyond comprehension. Mara had heard these tales, of course, but she dismissed them as superstition, stories meant to keep the inexperienced away from the cliffs and glaciers. Yet as she approached the narrow trail leading to the glacial lake, a prickle of unease slid down her spine. The air felt heavier here, thicker somehow, as if each inhalation drew in a memory she could not place. By mid-afternoon, the lake's glassy surface reflected the pale sun, the cliffs, and the golden larches perfectly. Drone footage she had set up earlier captured the serene scene, but in the shadows behind her, something moved. A dark shape, elongated and bending unnaturally around a rock, seemed almost liquid in its motion. Mara adjusted her camera, brushing off the sensation of being watched, telling herself it was only a trick of the light. But a low, pulsing hum began to thread through her audio recorder, subtle at first, almost mistaken for wind. It was not wind, not machinery. Something else, patient, deliberate, and impossibly silent in its intent. Evening came, though the sun seemed reluctant to fully descend behind the mountains. Mara prepared her camp near a cluster of larches, the golden needles fluttering softly in the light breeze. She organized her gear with her usual precision. Tripod set, cameras charged, batteries stacked, notebooks in order. Everything was methodical, meticulous. And yet, somewhere in the forest, the hum grew stronger. At first, she told herself it was an echo bouncing off the cliffs, some strange natural resonance. But then she noticed the shadows. They moved in ways no wind or animal could explain, stretching, bending, vanishing, and reappearing a fraction of a second later. Mara felt the first real prickle of fear then, a cold awareness that the forest was watching her, not observing, but waiting. That night, the forest fell silent, unnaturally so. No rustle of leaves, no distant call of a raven, no whisper of wind. Only the faint, insistent thrum, vibrating through her bones, through the pine needles beneath her fingers. She wrote in her journal, shaky-handed, describing shapes in her peripheral vision, impossible shadows folding over rocks, a sense of presence that was neither animal nor human. The golden light she had chased all day seemed to retreat from the lake, leaving it opaque, a mirror for nothingness. She packed her gear, thinking perhaps she would move closer to the ridge, to regain perspective, to confront whatever the forest had drawn her toward. But as she stepped onto the trail, the hum intensified. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, and the shadows lengthened in ways that made the trees look alive, waiting, stretching for her. By dawn, Mara had not checked in. Rangers found her vehicle untouched at the trailhead, cameras packed neatly inside. Near the lake, her tripod stood alone, her primary camera vanished. Footprints stretched only a few dozen meters into the thick firs, then ended abruptly. No broken branches, no disturbance, no indication that anyone or anything had passed through. The forest had erased her, leaving only faint echoes of her presence and the pulse of that low-frequency hum. And the forest waited, patient, silent, deliberate, as if it knew she had merely stepped into another layer of its domain, a place where time and memory were optional, and where the light never fully returned. The search began at first light. Helicopters cut across the ridge lines, their blades slicing through the crisp morning air, sending startled flocks of birds spiraling skyward. Ground teams fanned out along every trail Mara could have taken, climbing jagged granite outcroppings and winding their way through the thick pine forests. The forest, however, seemed to resist their movements. The further they ventured, the heavier the air felt, as if it pressed against their chests and slowed each breath. Dogs refused to enter certain sections, noses glued to the ground, low growls vibrating in their throats, ears pinned back. Even the most experienced rangers exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers carried between them, soft and cautious. There's something wrong here. Something watching. Near the glacial lake, Mara's footprints had vanished entirely. The soil, soft and damp the day before, now appeared untouched, impossibly smooth. Rocks along the shoreline bore no impressions from her boots. A single scrap of her journal fluttered against a pine root, edges ragged, ink smudged by morning dew. The entry spoke of her day in detail. Golden larches, frozen cliffs, her camera setups, the low hum that had followed her. But then the tone shifted, jagged and frantic. It's here. I can feel it. Don't follow the trail. Don't. Volunteers moving deeper into the backcountry reported subtle disturbances that made seasoned rangers' stomachs tighten. Compasses spun uncontrollably. GPS coordinates leapt hundreds of meters without explanation. Radios emitted bursts of static, sometimes layered with faint whispers that almost mimicked human voices. In the quiet hollows, one volunteer swore he heard faint footsteps behind him, matching his pace, though when he spun around there was nothing. No tree moved, no animal stirred, not even a branch creaked. Another searcher described feeling a sudden cold where the sun should have been warm, the hairs on his neck rising as though the forest itself was aware of their intrusion. Locals who had hiked Cathedral Peak for decades began to speak up, reluctantly at first. They spoke of signs Mara would have encountered, but likely dismissed. Unnatural stillness in the forest that made the air feel thick and aware, the hum that followed anyone who strayed too far, shadows that bent impossibly and appeared in places no human could occupy. It's not stories, a retired ranger said quietly, glancing at the ground as if to avoid attracting unseen attention. The mountains, they take people, not always violently, not always quickly. Sometimes it's patience, sometimes it's curiosity. You wander too far, and they notice. You become part of their memory. By the third day, a recovered memory card from Mara's drone offered chilling insight. Initial footage was mundane larches, cliffs, sparkling lake, but the last sequences froze the search teams in their tracks. Shadows moved unnaturally, twisting and folding between trees, appearing and disappearing in impossible patterns. One frame captured a faint silhouette reflected in the lake, just beyond the tripod's edge. It seemed humanoid, but stretched, elongated, bending the air around it like heat rising from asphalt. In the next frame, it vanished. Audio analysis revealed a low-frequency hum, layered and pulsing, beneath the ambient wind, almost like multiple entities vibrating in unison. Within the hum, a whisper emerged, unmistakably human, faint yet clear, calling Mara. Even the ranger's technology faltered. GPS units reset to default coordinates randomly. Watches stopped or ran backward. Thermal cameras recorded pockets of freezing air, inexplicably cold in areas otherwise warm. One ranger described a sudden fog settling in a hollow, thick and suffocating, only to vanish a minute later. It left behind a metallic scent, sharp and almost acidic, lingering in the nostrils of everyone who passed through. As night fell on the third day, the search teams gathered near a ridge overlooking the lake. Darkness crept across the forest with unnatural speed, shadows deepening even in areas where the moonlight touched. They reported faint whispers drifting through the trees, too structured to be wind, almost melodic yet horrifying in cadence. Some swore they heard Mara's voice, calling for help, slow and deliberate, hollow, echoing from multiple directions at once. One team member pointed to a dark patch in the firs, claiming he saw movement that bent and shifted in ways impossible for any animal. When they approached, the movement vanished, leaving only silence and the lingering pulse of that low hum. By now, the fear among the searchers was tangible. Not panic, exactly, but the deep, bone-deep understanding that the forest was alive in some way they couldn't comprehend. It wasn't hunting them. It was observing, cataloging, waiting. Every sound, every movement, every faint disturbance seemed intentional, as though the forest was curating the search itself, keeping them off balance, reminding them that this place had rules they could not understand. And Mara Ellison remained gone. By the fourth day, a quiet desperation had settled over the search teams. Helicopters still hovered above the peaks, cameras scanning for heat signatures. But ground teams had begun to notice an unsettling pattern. The forest seemed to shift around them. Trails that had been mapped hours earlier now twisted in ways that made no sense. A small ridge they had crossed in the morning appeared miles away when retraced. GPS devices fluctuated wildly, repeatedly returning coordinates that no human-made map accounted for. Radios crackled with static, often punctuated by faint, layered whispers that seemed to mimic words, or worse, imitate voices of the searchers themselves. The dogs were the first to signal real danger. Packs that had tracked Mara's scent effortlessly now whimpered, ears flat, tails tucked, refusing to advance even when coaxed. Some bolted back to the main trailhead, shaking as though they had seen something unnatural. Even the most stoic handlers admitted they had never seen behavior like this. One handler whispered to a colleague, "They know we're here. They know we're looking." The forest, they realized, wasn't passive, it was aware, patient, waiting. Searchers began finding anomalies that defied logic. Rocks along the riverbed were polished to a glassy smoothness, as if some invisible hand had worked on them. Trees bore scratches, long vertical gouges stretching unnaturally, some on trees that were centuries old and otherwise untouched. Moss had grown on the ground in strange geometric patches, hexagonal shapes that seemed deliberately formed, untouched by footfalls. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, clinging to clothes and skin, making the searchers' mouths dry and their throats raw. At the lake, Mara's campsite remained eerily pristine. Her tent was gone, but everything else stayed in perfect order, tripods still planted, batteries stacked, her journal half open on a rock. But there was something new. A single boot print appeared in the mud, impossibly large, facing into the dense forest instead of the trail, with a shallow drag line that disappeared into nothing. No other prints followed it. No marks of struggle, no broken branches, no indication that a person had passed that way. The forest had claimed her, and yet it left a trace, just enough to remind the living that it was deliberate, patient, and aware. At nightfall, teams reported auditory anomalies that left even the most experienced ranger shaken. Faint laughter drifted through the trees, childlike yet distorted, almost mocking. Whispers carried the syllables of Mara's name, drawn out, twisted, emanating from multiple directions at once. Some rescuers swore the forest itself was responding, bending the echoes, folding space and sound in impossible ways. One searcher, a volunteer with decades of hiking experience, whispered after a brief lapse of silence, "I've seen bears, storms, avalanches, But nothing like this. It's alive. Technology failed in bizarre patterns. Thermal cameras detected cold pockets, isolated and intense, in areas with warm ambient temperatures. GPS units jumped erratically, mapping impossible coordinates. Watches stopped or ran backward. Even simple lights, like headlamps or flashlights, flickered without batteries running low. The forest seemed to toy with them, altering perception, bending physics in ways that no one could explain. By the fifth day, a small group of rangers ventured farther than anyone dared. They discovered a half-collapsed cabin, obscured by thick pine and barely visible on old maps. The structure had been abandoned for decades, yet inside were fresh signs of disturbance. Branches pushed aside as though forming a path. Walls etched with scratches that resembled humanoid figures, but stretched and warped unnaturally. Torn pages of a journal from decades earlier described similar events: people disappearing near Cathedral Peak, strange low-frequency sounds, shadows that moved against the wind. The cabin felt alive, oppressive, as if it was waiting for someone to arrive, cataloging each intruder. Some searchers reported fleeting glimpses of a tall, impossibly thin figure moving between the trees, bending space around it. Shadows stretched, twisted, and collapsed in ways no human eye should see. Those who glimpsed it felt their balance falter, a sensation of vertigo and nausea overtaking them, compelling them to retreat. Even the strongest rangers admitted that fear had never felt so immediate, so physical, so unavoidable. The forest was not simply a backdrop, it was the antagonist, patient and meticulous, guiding the living away, allowing only fragments of Mara to be glimpsed or heard. By the evening, the hum returned. Low, pulsing, rhythmic, vibrating not just in the air, but through bones and teeth. It was maddeningly persistent. Whispers layered upon it, indistinct yet hauntingly familiar, calling out names in drawn-out cadences, blending human, animal, and something else entirely. One ranger, headphones pressed to ears during playback of drone audio, swore he heard Mara's voice begging, pleading, then laughing in a way that was not hers, layered over itself, distorted, alien. And still, Mara Ellison was gone. The forest held her, a secret it would not release. Even as search teams retreated at nightfall, exhausted, shaken, and broken, the hum lingered, pulsing just beyond perception, a subtle reminder that the wilderness watched, waited, and sometimes took. By the sixth day, the search teams were fraying at the edges of sanity. Exhaustion had taken root in their muscles and minds, but the forest seemed tireless, patient, unrelenting. The mountains and pines, once merely obstacles, now felt like sentient walls pressing in on every side. Every rustle of needles, every shift of shadows, made even the most seasoned rangers freeze mid-step. The air had a weight now, a pressure that didn't lift, thick with the metallic tang that had haunted them since the first day. It clung to their skin and hair, bitter on their tongues, and somehow carried the faint, echoing pulse of the hum, rhythmic and hypnotic. Ground teams reported new anomalies. A small stream near a hidden gorge, normally flowing freely, appeared still and glassy, reflecting the sky in strange angles. Trees along its bank were bent in unnatural arcs, forming tunnels of branches too symmetrical to be natural. Footprints appeared, faint and distorted, crossing over one another in impossible patterns. One volunteer with decades of tracking experience stared at the prints and muttered under his breath, "This isn't human, not fully." Some prints pointed uphill, others toward sheer cliffs, yet none led out of the forest. The patterns suggested movement, but not on any plane the searchers could follow. Near the edge of Cathedral Ridge, a small group discovered Mara's abandoned pack. Everything inside was intact: food, water, first aid supplies, camera equipment, but there was something unsettling. The journal had been opened to a new page, one that none of the searchers had seen before. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, almost alien, scrawled across the page in loops and lines that made sense at first glance, but the words twisted and repeated in ways that seemed to mock logic. It watches. It waits. It bends. I see it. I follow. I am not alone. The air has teeth. Don't step. Don't breathe. Don't look. That evening, the team set up camp on a rocky plateau. Fog rolled in earlier than expected, drifting in thin layers that moved against the wind, clinging to the trees and obscuring the terrain. Thermal cameras flickered and died intermittently. Radios hissed with static, occasionally forming words, sometimes their own names, sometimes incomprehensible syllables, all overlaid on the low-frequency hum that now seemed omnipresent. Some rangers began speaking in whispers to each other, terrified to break the unnatural silence that the forest demanded. A volunteer reported seeing a figure at the far edge of the plateau. It was taller than any human, impossibly thin, stretching upward and bending the space around it. When the team rushed forward, it was gone, but the sensation lingered. The air felt wrong, distorted, vibrating against their bodies. Every sound seemed delayed or displaced, echoes arriving before the actual noise. One ranger swore he felt the brush of fingers across his arm, but when he looked, there was nothing. No leaves stirred. No animals were nearby. Inside a hollowed-out grove, they discovered an old mining shack, long abandoned, half buried in moss and fallen pine. The wood was warped, yet long claw-like scratches etched from floor to ceiling remained fresh, as if something had clawed at the walls recently. The air inside smelled metallic, pungent, and cold, though outside it was a warm summer evening. One ranger picked up a shard of broken glass and swore he heard a whisper, not carried on the wind, but directly in his mind. Do not leave. Do not follow. It watches. Night deepened, and with it, the forest grew louder. Whispers layered over the constant hum now, growing distinct. Some rescuers heard Mara calling out, yet it was wrong her voice distorted, slowed and sped up, hollow, repeating fragments of sentences that hadn't been spoken. Others heard children laughing softly, echoes too close, too precise, emanating from deep within the trees. The shadows themselves seemed to move independently, stretching across the rocks and underbrush in ways that defied geometry. Even the moonlight seemed bent, casting beams at angles that made no sense, illuminating patches of forest that should have been hidden. One team wandered into a grove where the snowmelt had formed small ponds. The reflections were wrong. Shapes appeared in the mirrored surfaces that weren't present in the trees or the rocks above. Figures stood just beyond the edges, elongated, twisted, impossible. The air thrummed with the pulse of the hum, vibrating through the ground and their bones. Every time someone reached toward the reflection, it rippled violently, warping the image until it vanished. A faint trail of frost formed across the mossy ground, geometric and perfect, a path that led deeper into the forest but seemed to go nowhere. By dawn, the searchers were shaken beyond belief. Some refused to speak, eyes wide, scanning the tree line as if expecting something to step out. Others whispered about hallucinations, shapes in the peripheral vision, whispers that seemed to predict their own movements. Cold spots where the air was heavy, almost viscous. The forest had learned to manipulate perception, bending reality just enough to disorient, to confuse, to terrify. And Mara Ellison remained missing. The forest did not release her. It had taken her, but slowly, deliberately, making the living witnesses understand that this place was patient, intelligent, and absolute. Every shadow, every whisper, every impossible reflection reminded them that the wilderness was not just unforgiving. It was sentient, watching, and it had a memory longer than any human could comprehend. The search teams began retreating, exhausted and unnerved, leaving the area for the night. But the hum did not leave. It followed them down the ridges, threading through the trees, twisting through the valley, pulsing in the stone. And in the silence between the wind and the treetops, the faintest whisper could still be heard. Mara, Mara. Weeks passed. Hikers, campers, and locals began reporting unsettling occurrences near the cathedral ridge and the lake where Mara had vanished. Shadows twisted at impossible angles, slipping along the edges of the trees, sometimes appearing taller than any human could be. Electronics failed without explanation. GPS devices jumped miles away in seconds. Radios crackled with bursts of static, layered with voices that seemed to speak directly into the mind. Even the most seasoned outdoorsman admitted to a creeping unease, a feeling of being watched by something patient, intelligent, and absolutely indifferent to human presence. One evening, a small group of amateur hikers approached the lake, unaware of the area's grim reputation. The sun was low, casting elongated shadows across the water, and the air was unusually still. As they set up a brief rest, one of them, a young woman named Lila, noticed a reflection in the water that did not match the shapes around her. A tall, distorted figure stood behind her in the mist, elongated, bending light in impossible ways. She spun around nothing. The surface of the lake was perfectly calm, but a low, pulsing hum began to vibrate through her chest and the soles of her boots. The air itself seemed to resonate, pressing in on them. Her companions laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease, but the forest was not amused. Shadows stretched across the rocks and pines, moving independently of the trees, coalescing into strange forms at the edge of vision. The hum grew louder, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, but wrong, off-kilter. A sound that seemed to belong to something alive and ancient, aware of their intrusion. Then, from somewhere deep in the pines, a voice. Clear, unmistakable, yet warped. Lila, Lila. Panic set in. The hikers ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, but the forest did not release them. Every trail looped back. Every ridge mirrored itself in impossible ways. GPS units spun erratically, throwing them off course, while radios hissed with overlapping voices, some pleading, some mocking, some whispering fragments of sentences they had never spoken. The hum penetrated their bones, and each step forward felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted their movement. Then, at the far edge of the lake, one of the hikers froze. A figure emerged from the mist, tall, impossibly thin, bending space around it. And for a terrifying moment, they saw Mara Ellison. Oh, what had become of her? Her form was translucent, elongated, eyes wide with a silent scream, mouth moving in soundless horror. She reached toward them, but the air rippled around her, folding like water, and then she was gone. Only the echo remained her voice, stretched and distorted, repeating names, pleading, laughing, screaming, all at once. The hikers ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks. The forest seemed to shift with each step, guiding them, shaping itself to keep them off course. They reached the ridge just as night fell, and the shadows deepened into shapes that moved independently, bending the moonlight. Cold pockets of air froze their breath, and frost formed on their clothes, geometrically perfect, as if marking invisible paths. The whispers followed them, repeating fragments of Mara's journal, the words she had scrawled in fear. It watches. It waits. Don't look. Don't move. You're already here. By midnight, only one of the hikers made it back to the trailhead. He was shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide, unable to speak for hours. He swore that every sound, every shadow, every rustle in the trees belonged to something ancient, something beyond comprehension. Mara Ellison was never found. No trace, no footprints, no equipment, only the echoes she left behind, the hum that now lingered in the stones, the water, and the pines. Glacier National Park remains breathtakingly beautiful, but it is patient. It waits. It watches. And sometimes, when the wilderness decides, It reaches out and takes. Mara wasn't lost. She wasn't afraid. She simply wandered too far from the path, and the forest made certain she would never return. Even now, if you step carefully along the ridges or peer across the lake at dusk, you might hear the faintest whispers, the low pulse of the hum. And if you listen too closely, you might hear her voice, calling your name. The wilderness is unforgiving. The forest is patient. And some disappearances are permanent. Ever lived one yourself? Drop it in the comments. Let's grow together through these stories. Subscribe, and I'll bring you more.